All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 10, Jacksonian Democracy, 1820 to 1840. Section 1, A New Political Style from John Quincy Adams to Andrew Jackson. So let's just recall real quick that last chapter, Chapter 9, was all about industrialization. Right, about the Industrial Revolution, specifically as it took place in the North, right? That's pretty much what we focused on. And this had an impact on society, culture, and the economy, right? Economy. And roughly speaking, there's not a specific time period, but we're talking about right from, about 1800 to about 1850 is when a lot of these changes are going on. Now, Chapter 10, we're going to focus now to the politics, right? To the politics, specifically between the years of 1820 and 1840. So we're taking a different, we're viewing essentially the same time period, but now looking just at a different sort of topic. So let's start talking about some of the political changes taking place. So first of all, decline of federalism. So recall, the last place where we left off with United States politics was the first party system. The first party system was the system of the Federalists, which made up one political party, and the Democratic Republicans. Right, and this was the two-party system. A party system is any time where there are two main political parties and they dominate politics throughout the country. So no matter where you were, essentially you would only be voting for either a Federalist or a Democratic Republican candidate. Again, recall the Federalists wanted a strong national government. They were the Alexander Hamiltons, George Washington, John Adams. These all belonged to the Federalist Party. The Democratic Republicans included Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and also James Monroe, who was the fifth president of the United States. And so this system, more or less persisted in the early years of the United States, the early republic, until the election of 1816. That was where you had the last Federalist run for president. Right, run for president. The Federalists had Presidents 1, Washington, President 2, but President 3, 4, and then 5, James Monroe, all belong to the Democratic Republicans. So this first party system eventually comes to an end with the decline of the Federalist Party. And among other reasons why the Federalist Party declined over those years was their opposition to the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention, which was a meeting of the Federalists. This was covered in a previous chapter. A meeting of the Federalists to come out in opposition of the war. That proved to be a very unpopular position. And in fact, the Federalists, because they opposed the War of 1812, were labeled essentially treasonous and fell out of favor. So this old political system is going to give way, the first party system is going to give way to a new political structure. Another kind of relic of early American politics is this code of deference. You can think of deference like respect, and that is to say the Washingtons, especially George Washington, who is the best example of this code of deference, but even your Jeffersons, and a lot of the early politicians had been part of that revolutionary movement. And because they had been part of the origin story, so to speak, there was a certain code of respect or a code of deference that people played to politicians, so much so that they almost worshipped these early politicians. And the good example of this is the story about George Washington and the cherry tree, which kind of gave Washington almost like this godlike status. If you're not familiar, the story is that a young George Washington cut down a cherry tree, and when confronted about it, famously said, I cannot tell a lie. I cannot tell a lie. So that these founding figures were so pure and should be worshipped as such that even a guy like George Washington couldn't tell a lie through his entire life. This was kind of like an American aristocracy Aristocracy refers to nobility. Now, of course, there is actual nobility in the United States. It doesn't have a nobility based off of bloodlines, but, you know, your Washingtons, your Jeffersons, your Adams, I mean, you know, they are about as close to an American royalty as there is. You know, another way of thinking about the aristocracy is that all of these people make up the elite class of American politics, and they're almost, like I mentioned before, they're almost, you know, sort of godlike and mythic in stature. So these two things, this sort of mythic sort of perception of American politics and this first party system, will fall by the wayside and will change in these years between 1820 and 1840. We already know that the Federalist Party is more or less out of the picture, so that's one change, and then politics itself becomes much more popular. Now, politically, there are some very, very important changes taking place, specifically in regards to the right. Let's not even call it a right because it wasn't really a right, but just in terms of voting. Recall that in order to vote in the very early republic, you had to check 3 boxes. You had to be male, you had to be what was considered a white person, and you had to own property, right? So in order to vote in the days of Washington and Jefferson, own property, be a man, and be considered a white person. What's changing now in the 1800s is that this idea of property qualifications is getting removed, and what this leads to is an expansion of democracy. Right, so there's expansion of democracy taking place. You had people who advocated for universal manhood suffrage. Universal means all, manhoods means male, and suffrage means the right to vote. So this was a move essentially to get propertyless white men the right to vote, and this was unfolding itself on a state level. One thing that's important to remember here is that when it comes to voting, that is a state law. So each state has their own different voting laws. And what happened, or what was transpiring, was that those voting requirements were changing. So new states that were added to the Union had no property requirement. So outside of the original 13, you had states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, and as they gradually became added to the Union, they didn't have any property qualifications. And what that led to is that people were now leaving states that had property qualifications and moving to places where they could vote. And this eventually pressured the old states. So pressured old states to change too. And that's what they did. So even states like New York, which previously had property qualifications, got rid of them. Pretty soon, by the time you get to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and this is one of the reasons why they call it Jacksonian democracy, is that more or less all propertyless men could vote in all 13 states, or more than 13 states at that point, but could vote across the country, you know, at some point. But this is gradually transpiring. Instead of property or money being kind of one of the main focuses or being a consideration, instead there was much more emphasis placed on race, or actually we'll say gender first, and race in order to vote. And so as property became less important, you can think of race and gender becoming more important. So for example, you know, New Jersey is the case for gender, of course, that up until 1807, women could vote in New Jersey. That law was changed to deny women the right to vote there in New Jersey in 1807, only allowing for men to vote. For race, again, because it was statewide and it depended on, essentially which state you were in. As far as I know, all states in the South where slavery was legal, black men were denied the right to vote. But even in some of the free states in the northern states, you might have a voting requirement for black men that doesn't exist for white persons. So whereas blacks may not be exclusively barred from voting in some of the free states of the North, there may be further requirements like owning property, for example. And so race became a more of a focus then when it came to the right to vote. What this did, this expanding of democracy, right, this expansion of the right to vote, led to a new type of political system. We might call it party politics. We might call it popular politics. Because when the vote was restricted to so few people, you didn't really have to go out and get their vote. You didn't have to go out and earn their vote. But now that the democratic process is expanded, now these political parties need to work for people's votes. They need to let people know that A, they have the right to vote, which they didn't have before, and B, you should vote for our political party. And one of the early kind of pioneers in this new modern popular party politics were the Bucktails, which were located in New York. And they were headed by Martin Van Buren, who becomes later on a president of the United States. But he was really a pioneer in modern politics. And by modern politics, we mean having campaign headquarters and slogans and running newspaper advertisements and doing all the things that really modern political parties do in order to earn people's votes. And one of the things that he was successful in doing in getting done in New York was getting direct elections to choose various sort of positions within the government. So like the sheriff or something like that. So we'll say, a political position, right? Political position. So maybe like the sheriff. Whereas before, that was chosen by a council, right? The council got to choose whoever these positions were, but now people are going to vote to do it, right? And when it comes down to it, who has the power over the vote? Well, it's more or less the political party, right? So let's see if we can follow the bouncing ball here. So political parties influence who people vote for. People now have the right to vote for certain politicians or appointed positions within state governments. And so effectively, what this does is that it just completely cuts out the council, right? So this sort of group of elite politicians, including, state senators, state legislatures, the governor, perhaps. Now they're accountable to the people. But in an indirect way, now it is the political party who is now responsible for appointing certain positions. And oftentimes these political positions would have sort of a high salary and usually kind of a low workload. They were pretty comfortable. And so if you wanted to get one of these positions, ultimately your goal was to influence the political party. And this process of influencing the political party was referred to as the spoil systems, or a little bit out of room, but spoil system. That meant loyalty to political parties, right? Loyalty to political parties. So if you want a high salary, low workload job, you want a nice, comfortable government job, who do you have to be loyal to? You have to be loyal to the political party, because the political party can get people out to vote, and the vote will lead to these various political positions. So these changes taking place, the transformation of modern political parties and modern politics and the expansion of democracy, all came to a massive clash in the election of 1824. In the election of 1824, you had 4 candidates running for office. John Quincy Adams represented New England. John C. Calhoun represented the South. Henry Clay, in a lot of ways, represented the West, but more particularly, he represented what we're going to call the American system, something we mentioned in a previous chapter, but we'll review it again. William Crawford, who we don't really need to know a lot about him, and Andrew Jackson, who was the war hero, right? So because much of the electoral college was now being done through popular means, you had this fracturing in the election of 1824, and really the election was up for grabs. At the end of the day, both the popular vote and the electoral vote was won by Andrew Jackson, the war hero. In fact, in every single state that allowed for popular choosing the electoral college by popular means, voted for Andrew Jackson. The problem was that he did not have a electoral majority, right? Because there were so many different candidates, Andrew Jackson needed like 130 electoral votes. He only got around 100. And so then the election went to the House of Representatives. And, members of the House of Representatives would then choose who the next president would be. And we got some pictures of these individuals here. Here's Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, a very handsome John C. Calhoun, and then a Henry Clay. And so in the House of Representatives, you had two of the more mainstream politicians. We'll go, I don't know, I guess we'll use blue. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, who had been very much involved in politics before. Andrew Jackson was sort of the outsider, right? He was a general, he was a war hero, he was from Tennessee, he grew up on the frontier or the wilderness or whatever it was, not very well educated. But John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, even though they ran against each other, the last thing that they wanted was to see Andrew Jackson become president. So Henry Clay gave all of his votes to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams then appointed Henry Clay Secretary of State, and this allowed, or this process, or this deal is called the Krupp bargain. All right, so the Krupp bargain is Henry Clay gives his votes to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams gives Henry Clay, we'll just draw arrows here, a position in the Secretary of State. And that was enough for John Quincy Adams to become the next president of the United States. He was crowned, oh no, maybe we'll draw a crown right here. He was crowned 6th president of the U.S. Now, Jackson supporters, of course, as you might imagine, Jackson supporters cried foul, right? They said that Adams had cheated and that Jackson had been cheated out of the election, which essentially he did, because he did get the most popular votes. He did get the most electoral votes, just did not get that majority. And then once it went to the House of Representatives, that's when that corrupt bargain was made. And so John Quincy Adams as president, even though he wants to really invest in this American system, and again, the American system is an umbrella term for internal improvements, right? We can pretty much break it down to tariffs, which is taxes on imported goods, banking, and infrastructure, right? This is what John Quincy Adams wanted. Even though we can, even though Adams won the presidency and wanted to do all these things, a lot of Jackson supporters more or less rejected him, and it's going to be really this corrupt bargain here that motivates Andrew Jackson to run for president once again, fired up more than before, and all of his supporters fired up more than before to go for the next presidential election in 1828. However, when these tariffs and banking measures and infrastructure measures were being passed, it began to reveal a significant division between North and South. And this was the question about tariffs. So tariffs, like we said, a tariff is a tax on an import, and they're designed to protect American business, right? Business. Oops. However, tariffs don't affect all parts of the country equally. And so what was the case more or less in the United States? So we got Maine, there's Massachusetts, we'll go down, there's Florida, right? When you look at the United States, and maybe Maryland's right here, right? Here's your North, here's your South. When it came to industrialization, the part of the country that produced things, that was the North, right? All your factories were up here. That's where the production of goods were. Then you have a place like England, right? And who knows what England looks like, something like here. They got factories too, right? And in fact, they're producing something like, I don't know, steel. I don't even want to attempt to draw steel, but anyways, all right. So both England and the United States produce steel. It turns out that English steel is cheaper, right? It only costs $1. American steel is $2. And so when given the option in the South, let's say if they're building a railroad, when giving the option, the United States and other places are going to import, right? They're going to import it. But if you throw on a tariff, which they did, well, then when that is, when that hits the tariff, you add $2 to it. because it's a tax, right? And now when you want to buy steel from England, now it costs $3. And so when given the option of either buying American, right, which is only $2, or English, which is $3, you're going to buy the American, right? And the idea is that this is good for American business, but as you can see, it's good for the North. Is it good for the South? And the answer is no, because in the South, you've gone from buying cheap iron, or I guess we're using steel in this example, to more expensive steel, right? And so this tariff that was placed on manufacturing goods, here we're just using steel as an example, was protested by the South. So the South called these tariffs as this term describes, an abomination. We'll talk more about how this further divides the North and the South.